Hey, and welcome back to another edition of Paradigm Sherpas, the show where we meet with people who have done Sherpa-like heavy lifting as it relates to a variety of subjects. This Sherpa-like heavy lifting makes these people exceedingly capable of helping folks like myself and others consider new paradigms of thinking and being. Today's guest is an ally of the planet and all its inhabitants, Dr. Craig Chalquist. Dr. Chalquist is also an author, deep educator, speaker, and loreologist. Yes, you caught that last one correct, a loreologist, which is someone who researches the study and craft of how we imaginatively shape fictions and lore into the stories we navigate by, or the stories we use to help us get through life. Dr. Chalquist is here today to discuss a variety of subjects that includes ecopsychology, relationship with animals and nature, his new optimistic sci-fi novel, Soul Map. We kick the conversation off today covering the theme of his joint work with Linda Bazell, Ecotherapy. Enjoy.
Some years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was looking into something called ecopsychology, which brings together psychology with environmental studies and says that they have a lot to talk about together, that we're part of nature and we're radically situated in the world. And as I was studying ecopsychology, I was living in Santa Barbara, and there was a local talk by Linda Bazell on ecotherapy. And I showed up for that just to hear what she had to say. And then that's how we met many years ago, and we're now friends and colleagues. And we published that book together, Ecotherapy. I think it was 2008. And but she was the person who introduced me to it, and she was actually doing ecotherapy with her clients. She's a marriage and family therapist, and she lives in a house that's surrounded by 1/3 of an acre that's basically a permaculture food forest that was designed by her and her husband, Larry Saltzman. And I think there's some YouTube videos on it where they actually take you through a tour. If you were hungry, you could eat your way through the whole place. It's just awesome. But she was the one that got me studying it and thinking about it. And from her work, I learned, and from writing the book, both of us edited this volume. And we learned about Howard Kleinbell, who is the person who named ecotherapy back in 1996. He may have been using the word before then, but that's when he published it. And so he was talking about ecotherapy. He had a very simple definition. He said it's establishing healing relations with the earth. So when we think about different kinds of nature contact, like being around plants, being around animals, forest bathing is really popular right now from Japan, things like that. Those are all different forms of ecotherapy, which is an umbrella term for all of that. And one thing that sometimes gets left out of the definition and the conversation these days is something that Kleinbell put a lot of emphasis on, as Linda and I do also, and that that the relationship is reciprocal. So that we need to give something back. Otherwise, we're just exploiting nature as yet another nature cure, which has gone all the way back through history. So it's important to have it be a relationship instead of just us taking.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really interesting. So this actually ties into a quote that I think I highlighted from that struck me from class, and it said, "The mentality of the conquering, displacing pioneer who moves around a lot but soaks up little and tends even less." So that's kind of the mindset you're talking about, that the majority of us, and I would say myself included, at many times operates from.
We're raised in it. We're conditioned by it. It's kind of part of our psychology. And when we go outside and we use nature as a cure, we feel better, but then we don't tend to ask about, well, what about the plants and the animals out here? How are they doing? And what about this ecosystem, and what does it need, right? So it's not much of a relationship if you're only taking. But when we start asking those other questions, then we begin listening and actually being in a relationship with everything that's around us.
So how does it look like in practice to you? Living in that mindset and like being a better steward and having a better relationship with, your immediate environment? Is it like tending to your yard and growing gardens like that, or that you mentioned you saw at Linda's, where it's like, oh, this garden is serving me, but it's also serving the animals, and it's, enriching the soil, or, what are different ways that looks like to you in practice?
Yeah, those are part of it. Also, when we listen into our moods and our feelings and even our dreams as we're in a particular place, sometimes we pick up things. That part of my work, starting with ecotherapy, but moving in a somewhat different direction, we've given the name terrapsychology to, and it involves that deeper listening to place and listening to dreams of place and things like that. But it can look like ordinary environmental advocacy work. If we know that an ecosystem is wounded, then we draw attention to it, or we get with other people who are trying to repair it, or even better, let it repair itself. Those are all ways of doing it, or a respectful relationship to the plants and the animals in the area, so that we don't just pull them up or displace them or whatever, but we're actually mindful of what they want and what they need. Those are all ways of doing it. Some people use activism, so they turn out so that a piece of land won't get destroyed. A lot of us too, who are interested in this nature connection psychology, a lot of us came from places that were treated like that. So Thomas Berry, who called himself a geologian, which is a great title, he wrote an essay that I think is available online called The Meadow. And he talked about how much he loves this place. And it really struck me when I read it, because as a kid, I grew up flying kites every spring in this meadow that was about 2 blocks from the house I was living in. And then it got paved under. So it became the parking lot of a highway patrol station, and then fences went up, and we could never go there again. And so presumably it's still, the ground itself is of course still semi-alive underneath all that paving. But to tend what that felt like is part of ecotherapy too, to give oneself permission to have an emotional reaction when we see things like that happen. So that's part of it too. Some of what we take as a personal, a mood shift or a stressor or some kind of psychological distress is actually us reacting to something going on outside of us, and we haven't made the connection.
Now that's interesting to me because I'm a big fan of many schools of thought, but the axiom of Hermeticism, the concept of as above, so below, as within, so without, it sounds like the latter portion of that phrase is kind of what you're saying, or at least asking us to call our attention to. Hey, what is this external environmental event representing, maybe with inside me? And would you say it's even fair to suggest that, like, as we heal some sort of trauma or bad pattern of behavior inside us, that maybe there's an external reflection to
I
that?
think there might be, but it doesn't seem to be enough sometimes. When we think about these destroyed biospheres, or rather ecosystems, they need more than that. I think they need actual care and replanting or soil regeneration or something like that. Just as with the human body, if it's damaged to a certain point, we have to have medicine.
Yeah.
But I like that. I like the Hermetic example because these ideas, they come down through history in different forms, but it's basically the same idea. So in ancient Egyptian religion, there was a goddess called Heka, Heka is how we spell it nowadays. And her name referred to universal connections that are also local. And so from that came the idea into Stoic philosophy and Hermeticism as well, of these universal sympathies, which is a great word. So when things vibrate in a certain way outside of us, we pick it up. I'm using vibrate as a metaphor, not a literal. And we sense it. And so psychologically, we know from psychoanalysis, family systems, that we're embedded in what happens around us. Our sense of self isn't confined to up here. So when other things suffer, we do too.
So you said, I really appreciate what you just said there about our sense of self isn't confined up here. Uh, well, I find I operate most of the time where my sense of self is up here, but I have had these moments in life that are probably the most meaningful for me, where it's almost like an amnesia like moment where I'm like, oh, my everyday operating consciousness is like a sliver of the whole pie that I really am. And being out in nature has certainly done that. Respectfully consuming psychedelics has got me to that place. And I've even been scared to that place once too. And now that I've done some research into near-death experiences, I actually it seems there's a pattern there with that. Um, yeah, so that's really interesting. I hear you too. What you said in response to what I was saying about the hermetic thing. Like it can't just be I heal me, and then there's a magical healing in nature. Like you have to be healing the inside and the outside simultaneously, and that takes operationalization, right?
Yeah, and I'm reminded too of an eco-psychologist who's a colleague of mine, Janine Canty,
Okay.
and she just published not too long ago, some months ago, a book on collective narcissism. And part of what she would say about all this, my understanding is from talking to her as well as the book, is that when we only think in terms of our own human wellness, healing, whatever it is, that's narcissism. Because we're ignoring everybody else who's out there. And, we can't be healthy on a declining planet, really, which is part of the point that eco psychology makes. So
Yeah, I
it's
actually
not
have this
dividable.
spot on with that comment because the next little quote I have highlighted that I remember that stuck with me. You pointed out in a lecture from James Hillman. It said psychology, so dedicated to awakening human consciousness, needs to wake itself up to one of the most ancient human truths. We cannot be studied or cured apart from the plant.
Yeah. And Hillman,
It's
in that, he
go
includes
ahead, sorry.
he includes homes, cities, roadways, all of that too, not just what we think of as nature and kind of put over here.
Yeah, no, I can totally appreciate that. I mean, as I like sometimes I'm driving on the highway and think like, oh, this is just like a big artery in some sort of bigger being, and I am a cell going through. And yeah, sure, if the roads are a mess, then the cell can't go to where it wants to go and deliver the information or nutrients or exchange it and get back to its place. Um, Maybe a very simplified metaphor, but there's all these living systems interrelated, and we do need to take care of them because if you neglect something over here, it has a downstream effect over there.
Speaking of that, I have an example. Right now, I'm living in Fillmore, California, which is was a small farming community, and it's being turned into a suburb. And so, you might hear it in the background. Past my house runs Highway 126, which didn't used to have much traffic. And now, with all these housing developments around here now, um, there's a lot of not only a lot more traffic, but in Fillmore itself, which is a small town, the traffic is horrible now. It's really congested. And so around the time this started to be a problem, a sewer line that runs parallel to 126 broke. And so there's now even worse traffic because there's a whole lane blocked off while they fix the thing, and it's going to take months, right? There's all this engineering that they have to do. And so it's like, if we looked at this through the lens of symbolism and metaphor, which is part of where my work with terrapsychology comes in, and your example of the cell in the body reminded me of that. It's like the circulation is now restricted here on both ends. you
Right.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. And heart attack is the next thing, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's scary. It's so my wife and I s- build camper vans, high top vans, like adventure vehicles. And as we were going through the country, you really see like the different areas where everything's really taken care of or not. And it does change the way you feel about entering those areas. It almost changes the collective consciousness of the people that inhabit it. And that doesn't
Yeah,
surprise me really, because when I think about, my personal space here at home, like if it's out of order for an extended period of time, like I start to feel out of order inside my head, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
So
They do tend to go together.
with that, I guess, thought in mind, like how I'm thinking about people who live in the city, right? Like I used to live in Cleveland, Ohio. Some people would say it's not a big, much of a city, but it's still a big, it's a fairly big city, million people. Do you have like how do people who live in that environment like get in tune with nature? I mean, it's almost like
Yeah,
those environments need it more than anything. Like there's a part of me that feels bad that I left Cleveland. I mean, I left Cleveland to be, a minute from hiking, skiing in the mountains now here in New Hampshire. Not to run away from it, but I hope there's people there that are like, hey, how do we get more in touch with nature, integrated into the city and part of our everyday lives? And I do think there are people that are doing that. But any
yeah.
ideas about how the average citizen does this when in the city?
So even in the city, there's nature, and there's there's a lot of pretty good research that shows that even when you bring a little bit of it indoors or spend time with some of it outside, like in a city park, it makes all kinds of differences to your wellness, your mood, your anxiety levels go down, your physical health is better. There's a bunch of research on that. So even people bringing, a plant or some stones or whatever it is indoors can be helpful to reconnect if it's done in a mindful way, and just taking whatever opportunities you can to go outside. I always try to get out. I get out every single day because I just don't feel right if I don't. So that's one thing to know about oneself. Like, how much nature do you really need? And when we live in cities, we sometimes forget that. And, but on the other hand, we don't sleep well and we don't connect the two, or we feel anxious and we don't connect that either. So I know about myself from doing this work that I have to get out for an hour every day. That's just mandatory, rain or shine, whatever is going on out there. And so sometimes when it's raining, I like to go out and just out in the rain for a little bit and have it come down on me and just feel what that's like. So there's really simple things people can do. Ariana Candell is an ecotherapist who works um, with a lot of people. She does a lot of training, and she has this one exercise that's kind of I forget what she calls it, but like if you go to a botanical garden, not just to see the plants, but also to smell them and to see what memories they evoke. And so she makes it into a conscious little journey among the flowers or whatever's growing in there. So that's a way of doing it too. And then people having pets is another form of this. If it's mindful.
Yeah. Well, all right. So two things I want to comment on. First, the smelling, and then the pets, because the pets was somewhere I wanted to go for sure. So yeah, just that's really nuts. The way you described it to me is like, or the way I'm reading it is like almost like every smell of a flower or plant could be a way to trigger your subconscious and some dormant thing that's either connected to that smell or at least triggered by that smell to pop up to the surface. It almost reminds me of like pulling a tarot card, and then like
Yeah.
that is like something that you just interact with and it's prompting your subconscious.
Yep.
So that's very cool. I hope everybody out here or that's listening goes and smells all the plants this weekend and explores what that brings to the table for them. But pivoting over to pets, this was something that I went back and reread some of my papers for you just kind of to prepare for our conversation, and I had a big dumb smile on my face because one of them went into depth about you know, the impact of pets in my life. Now, I grew up, all my friends had pets. My parents loved animals, but, they didn't have 100% faith that me and my siblings would take care of them, which I think was probably pretty fair. Uh, but now at this point, I'm hopefully a much more mature person, and I joined my wife when she already had this dog, and I never realized how meaningful it would be for me.
Mm.
And I'll stop rambling in a second here, but what I want to point out is one, how intuitive they are. They could sense your emotions even if you haven't said anything. But then two, how happy they can make you have the worst day ever, and you don't even need to go for the walk, but they're just happy to see you. But then when you go on the walk, they're so happy. You're out in nature. You're getting smells, temperatures, potentially perspiration, like all that stuff that the human being has been immersed in for millions and millions of years. And I think in your course, you even mentioned that this concept of being inside most of the time really has only existed for the past 100, maybe 200 years, if even. And so people don't even think about that huge shift for the physical body, let
Yeah,
alone, the mental shift. But yeah, I'd love to understand how you view pets, because I try and view my pet as like, I'm not its owner, I'm its steward, and there's an exchange there. Like,
yeah,
yeah, sure, I provide for it so it can eat and that stuff, but it's giving me companionship and love, and I'm trying to reciprocate that. And I don't know, the whole thing has enriched my life tremendously, and I would have never believed it without experience in it. Not that I didn't love animals, but once you're in that position of quote unquote stewardship, is that how you kind of view pets? Like, hey, like you're my buddy and I got your back and we take care
oh
of each
yeah.
other?
Yeah, I had an early instructor in that. I grew up in a house that was pretty abusive and violent, and there were times when I would just retreat as a boy to my bedroom to get away from all the hitting and screaming and everything else that was going on. And there was this cat in the house, Tommy, who would come in and sit with me, which there's so many stories out there about sensitive animals that do that. They curl up with people who are dying. They come to people who are just in a terrible mood or whatever it is. And not necessarily to cheer us up, although they do that too sometimes, but just to let us know non-verbally, I feel what you're going through and I'm here for you. And a lot of animals do that. And so that was, for me, that was really helpful. And when he died, I of course was grief stricken, and to this day I miss him, and that was, I don't know how many years ago, but yeah, there's a habit out there that some of us are getting into. We're shifting away from the word pets and more like animal companion, which is a clumsier term. But so that's one way of doing it. Or else we could just redefine pets and say that we don't, by pets we don't mean commodities or that we own them. We mean that they're our companions, our friends. And one thing too that comes up, I kind of struggled with this again years ago when I was learning to ride horses, which I haven't done that often, but there was a period in my life when I just wanted to because I love horses and I like being around them. And my concern was riding them. Like, isn't that demeaning to them, or are we a burden to them, or whatever? And I learned pretty quickly that horses will tell you non-verbally if they don't feel like being ridden, and that sometimes they enjoy it, and you can feel it. And they'll even give other animals a ride. There's horses that give cats a ride, and they'll come up to them and basically go, "Get on my back," and then they'll take them around.
Yeah.
So, you can tell. There was a horse named Bella that, a big thoroughbred that I used to ride sometimes. And when I went to the ranch and started to get the tack ready, and I was going to take her out, she would she would do a couple of things. She would stay in her barn, and then she would go over to the bin where her oats were, and she would chew them, and then they would just fall out of her mouth. So she wasn't really eating. And that was her way of saying, I'm pretending to eat and I'm in here because I don't want to ride today. And I would always respect that.
Yeah.
And as a result, when I was riding her one time, I was making the beginner's mistake of, when the horse starts to really power up and take off, it's instinctive to grip the horse with your legs. And when you do that, sometimes your feet pop out of the stirrups because you need to keep your heels down. And
Okay.
so you kind of go, you know, And whenever I did that, she would slow down and then turn her head sideways so she could watch me with one eye, and she would wait until I got my feet back in the stirrups. And so I told the trainer, I said, that's amazing how Bella has been taught to look after human riders. And she said, oh no, she wasn't taught that at all. She likes you because you respect her. And I went, oh, so that was a learning for me too.
Interesting. I love that because it goes to show that um, there's different levels of bonds, right? And that, they're not just thoughtless, like, oh, it's a person. I love every person. It's like, no, I developed this trusting relationship with Dr. Chalquist, and I'm trying to make sure my friend's okay. Like that's super meaningful, and it shows tremendous emotional intelligence, I think.
Oh, they're very bright. Yeah. There's a lot of ecotherapy happening with people who've been through sexual assault, post traumatic stress from combat, all kinds of really traumatic things. And that usually doesn't involve riding the horses, but just being around them. And there's all kinds of not only stories, but research about how soothing that is for us too. And the people who talk about it, I've heard combat vets talk about this, and they always insist that it's a relationship, that they're not just getting healing from the horse, that they
Yeah.
actually know each other to some extent.
Oh, for sure. Well, it's so obviously it's nonverbal. I mean, different animals can make noises, right? And use their vocal cords, but a lot of, I guess, what I perceive as the interaction is nonverbal, and it's like maybe physical, maybe face gestures, but like there's just without being woo, there's a vibe there, right? And you kind of sense each other's intentions, and I don't know. I'm sure it's a collection of things, right? Like
Yeah,
the intonation of my voice, how fast I approach them, if I approach them gently, like, I'm sure that all feeds into the interactions, but I've been always moved by, the nonverbal, what I feel like is understanding sometimes that I have with my cat or dog. It's pretty
mhm,
powerful.
yeah,
Now, I want to ask you this. Outside of that, I've heard of something pretty interesting lately. So my professional career, I work with like AI software,
mhm,
and this concept of large language models is emerging on the scene. And I've heard about people who are using large language models to find the patterns in like whale clicks or maybe
yeah,
a bat and something like that, and that there's maybe the potential that we'll understand the patterns and then be able to click back someday.
yeah,
That would be mind blowing to me to have, that sort of Dr. Doolittle capability for,
yeah,
instead of just guessing and being like, oh, Lola loves me. That's what she's thinking when she looks at me, to like, yeah, it's weird. There's a lot of bad trajectories because of technology, right? And, the way we interact with nature, which includes animals and plants, obviously. But how do you sit on technology? I don't
mhm.
mean to pivot away from animals, but it seems like a little bit of an organic segue. Like, what technologies excite you about honoring the environment, and is there a place in all ecotherapy to consider technology?
I think so. There's that word that refers to the technology of indigenous people. Um, so they had their version of this and continue to. So it's not like tech is new. We've always had some involvement with it. But in terms of the more updated things like AI and all that, I always think of technology as an amplifier. So, if it's hooked up to our better angels, as Lincoln liked to call it, it'll do wonderful things. And if it's not, it'll act out our shadow. To use a Jungian term, it'll create monsters. And there's a there's a scene in a novel I just independently published called Soul Map. Takes place. It's a science fiction novel that takes place about 50 years from now. And one of the things that happens as a result of technology and AI is that we are able to speak to cetaceans, so dolphins, whales, related species. And so they decide one day to stage what I have like a historical timeline that plays out over the centuries, and
Okay.
this marker in it is called the Cetacean Revolt. And so they use AI equipment that we give them to protest how we treat them, and they blockade all of the theme parks in the world in one movement. And then there's a dolphin ambassador who says these are our terms, right?
I mean, that's awesome. I hope that we get to that point so that they can tell us how, part of my language, but shitty we've been in terms of being stewards to their existence on this planet, especially
Yeah,
as it relates to SeaWorld and stuff like that. I mean,
yeah,
I get stir crazy in my house, like,
yeah,
being here a remote worker. I can't imagine if I never was afforded the opportunity to even go outside, like a killer whale in captivity that's living in a bathtub.
yeah. It's yeah, it's awful to think about. So they during the revolt, that's one of the things they want us to stop doing. Dangerous fishing practices, those have to go away. Polluting the ocean has to go away. And they have timelines for all this, and also the best attorneys in the world. So they have quite a protest. But I think that, like in the old days, researchers had to really take their time and figure out, what the languages were telling us. And they do seem to be languages. We know that orcas speak different dialects depending on what part of the ocean they're in. So in social groups, and so we know that other cetaceans do too. But in terms of AI, it's like in the past, you had to watch a dolphin for a long time to realize that when the dolphin's on the bottom in still water, and when it sends up a single bubble, it tends to mean, is anybody else here? So we have words in human terms,
Yeah.
bits and pieces of their vocabulary, but I think AI speeds all that up. So I could see a day when there's actually a translation, and I think that'd be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be outstanding, to wrap, and if we could give a real voice in a sense to these animals and make that known, I think it would change a lot of the ways we interact with them, especially, well, obviously the so-called theme parks, that are prisons for these things, but then also, like, commercial fishing practices and whale hunts and stuff like that. I think, when your food can talk back, not that this stuff is even all killed for food. It's sometimes just killed for sport, which is even worse. Now, that's not a knock on hunting. I will say that, I find the hunting community actually to be some of the best stewards of the environment that are out there, and they actually have a real honor for the animal, and because they're not so distant from the killing of it. It's actually not a commodity. It can be a more of a sacred thing for people, which I think is really meaningful. If you're going to kill something, like, it shouldn't be a very cavalier activity.
Yeah, I know some environmental stewards who are really putting a lot of effort and money into protecting the environment who are hunters.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm glad that we could, at least connect on that, because I think that it's important not to demonize that community. And the people I know that do great work, and a lot of the money for licenses and tags goes into it. I don't do it, but I can certainly appreciate what they've done for at least my community. But hey, I kind of wanted to maybe pivot back if we could. You brought up your publication, and it sounds really exciting. Now, I watched you posted a little bit about it, I believe, on Instagram maybe last week. And what really just got me going, and I went to go order it, but I don't think it's out yet, at least in paperback, maybe. And I'm a underliner, circler, that kind of thing. So I'm waiting for that. But yeah, could you tell us about it? It was so cool because you said, and I'll shut up after this, but that it's an optimistic sci-fi. And I was just like, wow, where has that been? Because, most of the stuff I'm seeing on Netflix or comes out of movies, it's like dystopian, world's falling apart, doom and gloom. And I don't, I there's too much of that. We need optimism here. There's a lot of challenges as a society, and we need more people that are saying, "Hey, look over here. There's good." And I don't know. It sounds like your sci-fi novel is kind of doing that.
I think it does. That's what I tried to have to do with it. It comes out of some years of writing short stories that I didn't publish. I just put them up on my website at chalquist.com so people can go there and read them. And I realized about a year and a half ago that I wanted to write more fiction than I was writing, and even a novel. And the protagonist in the novel was appearing in my dreams and in other kind of synchronistic ways before I even realized I was going to write about him. And Jung has a practice called active imagination, where you let these fictional characters just speak, and they say things that can surprise you. So when he popped up, I had a conversation with him in imagination, and I said, "Well, how about if I write a story about you?" And he said, "No, a novel." And I went, "Well, I don't have time to write a novel. How about a novella, right? We'll compromise, you know." And he's like, "No." So I wrote a novella because I'm the author.
Yeah.
And it just felt really incomplete. It just didn't feel like it was there yet. And so I was doing another active imagination with the character. His first name is Lucas, and I said, "Well, tell me about where we are with this." And he kind of leaned over and he said, "There's this whole underground life that I have that you don't know anything about." And then he told me about it, and I went, "I have to write about this." So by the time I got done, it was 93,000 words, and that's a novel. So he got his way.
I'm glad that Lucas was stubborn with you, because it sounds like it's going to be to the benefit of us all. Now, maybe a quick question about active imagination, and then we could kind of talk a little further about this if that's okay. So,
Yeah.
um, you said that Lucas came to you in a dream, but to me that started making me think of like lucid dreaming when you're interacting with them. Is active imagination a little bit different? Is that in the dream state, or is that outside, or can it be both?
It's outside, and it's when it's a lot like daydreaming, but you're doing it more deliberately. And it's almost like a meditative practice where you get in kind of a comfortable place where you have some time, and you invite into your imagination whoever wants to show up. And an image may come into it, or a character, or other things, and guided imagery sometimes does this a little bit too. And so what Jung discovered, when he was really good at it, you can tell from reading his journals, which I actually teach a class on at Jung Platform. They're called the Black Books. And he would just open his mind, and they would just come right into his imagination. He was very imaginative. And at one point, he was trying to interpret them psychologically as parts of himself. And they went, "No, we are our own entities," right? And he
Wow.
was stunned by that. He was like, "What? Someone's running around in my head that isn't me?" And so the Black Books are largely conversations with these imaginal characters, and they often disagree with him. So, I mean, there's different ways of interpreting who they are and where they come from, and the usual psychological, well, they're a part of this aspect of your personality or that aspect or whatever. But they have their own, what Jung said, they're autonomous. They have their own values, their own perspectives. And this is what authors of fiction have always said. Ursula K. Le Guin said, "I didn't invent Earthsea, I discovered it. It was there."
Yeah.
And Tolkien was writing about, talking actually about his process a little bit. And he said, "I was writing um, once, and this character named, who called himself Boromir, showed up. And I'm like, who is this guy?" And he said, "I kept writing to find out who Boromir was." So
It Yeah, it's so interesting. It reminds me kind of of musicians in a way too, where like a really well-trained musician would often say that like I'm just a vessel for like some sort of higher consciousness, and because I've practiced the guitar, I'm Trey Anastasio for Fish, or I'm Beethoven, or playing the piano, but because I've just readied the instrument, now I can receive that, and just like it just comes through me. Like I'm almost not even consciously aware of it while it's happening because I'm so in the moment and just like the processor of this information in a way.
I think that kept Beethoven alive. When he discovered his hearing was failing him, he wanted to kill himself, and he said so in letters. And then he said also, I realized that the art was bigger than me, that I still had something to say, and thank God, So
Yeah. Well, and that's whether it's an artist or your book or hopefully even this podcast, if I can humbly say, the hope is like put your authentic self into something and hopefully that can reverberate out and maybe just have enough of an impact to push somebody over the edge to take the step to do something that is in alignment with their authentic truth, and it can just kind of keep rippling out.
yeah, Jung had this charming little saying about it. He said, listen to the little people, meaning the imaginal characters, But so I try to do that in writing my fiction. And you mentioned optimism earlier. When I
Yeah.
was in college, I really liked dystopian science fiction. I read a lot of it. And
Yeah.
then something shifted. I think the outer situation shifted because we're in one of those situations right now. And so I stopped wanting to read more about it because that's basically the news, right? If anyone's paying any attention, the news is catastrophic environmentally and otherwise. So there's a movement afoot, and I'm thinking of people like Susan Quinn and P.J. Manny and who else? Kim Stanley Robinson, all of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting online, not in person. Well, I met Kim Stanley Robinson in person. We talked together at a conference in Hong Kong some years ago. But they all are on that wave of um, imagining positive possible futures, but they do it realistically. Like the Ministry for the Future is one of Kim Stanley Robinson's recent novels, and he takes climate change for not only for a fact, and he's got a lot of climate science in his book, but he rolls it forward a few years and says, this is how much worse it's going to be. Parts of New York City flooded and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So it's not the kind of hopefulness that just wants to ignore what's going on. It's the kind that shows how resilient and imaginative we can be when we work together. So inspired by that, my protagonist starts out being very individualistic and kind of a loner. And he's
Yeah.
forced to realize very quickly that he just can't do it by himself.
And who can, right? I mean, I don't
Yeah,
think we many of us make it through this journey in this thing called life without help. That's part of the game for sure.
yeah. Even people who are like Young, for instance, who are identified as this kind of lone genius who created everything, he was talking to a lot of people. He had all kinds of support. And there's a book by Nan Savage Healy that actually more or less argues that Jungian psychology was created by Jung and his companion Tony Wolff. She was his lover. She had been a patient at one point, and then they worked together. And um, so what we think of as Jungian psychology maybe should be Jungian and Wolffian psychology. So,
Sure.
and
No,
everybody's like Einstein talked to people, all those Newton.
I mean, I think in a way we all stand on the shoulder of giants, right? Like you said earlier that, hey, we treat the world so shitty because we inherited that kind of belief that like we could. But we also inherited a lot of good, right? We inherited all, some profound wisdoms through the ages. And this whole concept of ecotherapy that we were talking about earlier, I mean that's been around really forever. It's just the Western mind kind of blocked that out and forgot about it. And so that to me, like that whole concept is like reintroducing the West to almost a lost state of being that was the norm for forever, really. Not to pivot away from what we're talking about with your story here, but it just kind of seemed like a connection back to our earlier conversation.
I was just a couple of days ago listening to Four Arrows, who's Cherokee, talk about what he calls the original worldview, and he's referring to all indigenous people, and he calls it the kinship worldview, and it's extended beyond but includes human beings. So this idea that we're kin with everybody, human or non-human, is part of the worldview that he comes out of.
And I love that. And there's a lot of people that I'm talking to as this series goes on that none of us have absolute truth, but I think that people have put a lot of meaningful effort into finding strategies and new ways of being that can move us forward and really keep us going and alive, and not taking everybody down with us, and kind of hopefully going that optimistic sci-fi route that you're kind of talking about with your publication. I mean, that's the future I want to live in. I want to live in a place of abundance, where technology is paired with ethics and good reason, and everybody. I'm not naive enough to think that we'll always have utopia, but I certainly think that the world can be a much more peaceful and harmonious place. And, we can get to a stable place where we're not always on the brink of blowing each other up, or, engaging in tribal warfare, and, go into space peacefully, not as maybe a cancer cell, but as a white blood cell that can go out and, add value and balance to the overall scheme of existence, if you will.
There's a word that popped into my imagination some years ago, and when I was asking myself, what kind of a future would I like to live in? Because since childhood, these some of them are kind of utopian, some of them are not, but these images of a good future for humanity have been following me around for a long time. And the word Terrania came into mind as this grown from the ground up, this a planet-wide civilization in the truest sense of that word, where people are included, where people are safe, where there's abundance, where no one has to worry about being out of work. And it's not utopia. And my whole cycle of stories, which the novel is a part of at one point in this journey toward maturity and consciousness, the whole cycle is pointed in the direction of Terrania. And I have one story that's set in that world, and there's an outbreak of something that looks like fascism. And a point that one of the characters makes in the story is, for us being imperfect, there are no impregnable utopias. We always have to be vigilant. And so I wrote the story. It's called Vigilance. As an example, like a thought experiment, what would people in Terrania do in a situation like that? What would a mature, integrated, conscious bunch of human beings do when threatened by that? So I wrote the story to kind of answer that for myself, because I was curious too. What would they do?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm curious about that every single day as it relates to my life. What would a being of higher consciousness do in this situation? Yeah, I love that. I love that you can muse on that, and put something forth for people like me to read, and help get me to that level of thinking in different ways. So, just so everybody who's listening is aware, like where do they go? Do they go to chalquist.com, Amazon to get publications? Is it on Audible? Are you narrating it? Can you give us a little bit of background? Because I want to make sure folks can get out and read this, and maybe we'll have a book club session after everybody's got to read it, and
That'd be fun.
have some,
So if you go
yeah,
to
some
Chalquist,
media.
if you go to
Go ahead.
chalquist.com, there's a tab that says fiction. Or, sorry, there's a tab that says works, and it's in there. It's the direct link, I think, is /fiction, but anyway, it's at my website. So that's one place. There's a whole collection of stories. I think there's 30, called Tales of Terrania Rising. That was the first piece that I wrote. And then Soul Map is more recent. But the tales are free, so anyone can read them. To buy the book, which is $9 something, it's at Amazon. It's in Kindle right now. I'm going to wait a couple of weeks and then publish the paperback version, mainly because I just need to have the time to pull it together.
Yeah.
So then that one will be out, same price. And then let's see what else. I need to also at some point get it into Audible because I've been wanting to do that. Um, so
Well, yeah, I mean, awesome that it's out on Kindle already and people can get out there. I'll have to break my e-reader rule for this one just because I don't think my patients can wait for the paperback like I normally like to. But yeah, I'm sure people would love to hear you narrate it too, in the sense that like, hey, it's your story. It can't. Well, I was gonna say it's your story, but now after our conversation today, I'm like, oh,
yeah,
whose is it? But at least came to you, right?
yeah, several times. And when I got done with the draft of it, so I had another imaginal conversation with Lucas, the protagonist, and I said, I feel like I want to write another novel that's kind of either in parallel with this one or a follow up. What do you think? And he's like, I'm good for now. Somebody else, pick somebody else, you know. So I thought about it and I went, I know exactly who I'm going to write about for the next protagonist. So I've started that novel as well. I just wrote the first chapter and it's starting to already feel like it's something. So that'll be the
Oh,
next one.
that's great. And now, if I can ask, and it's okay if you can't share, but would it be a character that we meet in
Yeah.
the? Okay, okay, okay.
Yep. Hmm.
All right, awesome. Well, that is super exciting. I think we're kind of getting to the top of the hour here, and I want to certainly be respectful of your time. But maybe before we go, in closing, outside of your work, which again I highly encourage people to check out, not just the current work, but some of Dr. Chalquist's past work. It's really transformed my life. It's helped me understand the importance of getting out in nature and making that a part of my routine, so that I can be happier and better for the people around me. But is there any final thought you want to leave with people that, um, like you said, it's chaotic in the world in a lot of ways, and people are trying to center themselves and go forward, in a peaceful, happy way. But anything you want to share with the collective out there that you think would be meaningful for them?
I think maybe we tend to underestimate two things in this hyper individualistic culture. One is the power of imagination, and the other is the power of doing things together. You know, that whole question, can I make a difference, is wrongly phrased, I think, in terms of that kinship worldview. You know, can we make a difference? And we are the only thing that ever does make a difference. So I think if we can relearn how to dream and imagine together and then act on that basis, I think we'll be okay. We'll have to go through a lot of stuff. We've really set ourselves up for a lot over the next who knows how long. But whenever I think about it and kind of feel into my intuition, I feel like in the long run, I think it'll be okay,
Well,
ultimately.
well,
So
I share the optimism with you, and I'm 100% with you that we can do this together. We are not alone. We have a lot of power, and I think it's authentic connections like this, small acts of kindness that kind of help get us there. So, yeah, speaking of acts of kindness, I just want to sincerely thank you for
mhm.
showing up, interacting with me, offering your wisdom to the world, really, because this will be out on YouTube pretty soon. And we'd love to have you back again, especially after the next publication comes out, so that we can get everyone excited about that. But yeah, thank you so much for being here and spending some time with us. And we are honored to have you as a so-called paradigm Sherpa.
So thank you so much. I appreciate being invited on so we could have our conversation.